The breakup of the Beatles had seen the band's principal songwriters, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, tread very different paths as they emerged as solo artists. While both collaborated with their new wives, where Lennon had embraced the counterculture and found artistic freedom, McCartney had struggled to live up to huge expectations. Yet from 1973, their fortunes would change, and Lennon, whose marriage to Yoko Ono had been both a source of his creativity and his celebrity, began to lose his way.
He was having a terrible time, but he was also having a damn good time. He was getting drunk, and he was being this new character that was a guy he hadn't been since he was a single guy in Liverpool.
It was like being back in the Hamburg days when John was frustrated. He was frustrated, and he was, in a way, he felt, I'm free now, but he had lost the touch to the ground. He took off.
And McCartney, who had formed the band Wings in the early 70s, was about to re-emerge from the margins as one of the most successful artists of the decade.
The optimism, the energy, I don't think ever died. I think what did die was the will to see it through. Everyone could gush. One, we don't dislike him anymore because he broke up the Beatles. Two, he's done really good work. And that was just enough to open the floodgates of, oh, he's back. We always knew he had it in him, and there we are, and there's the proof.
Just number one hit after number one hit after number one hit. The joke back then was that there were people who didn't know that Paul had been in a band before Wings. That was how sort of overwhelmingly popular they were on their own terms. There was still beauty and transcendence to be found. And for a time there, you know, from Band on the Run through Wings at the Speed of Sound and then the live album after that, they were at the absolute apex of the pop music scene.
When it was announced in April 1970 that the Beatles were going their separate ways, few could have imagined the fortunes of Lennon and McCartney in the following 2 years. Lennon had already been establishing himself as a major recording artist in his own right, while the Beatles were still together, and the split seemed to him a liberation. Having already released a set of avant-garde recordings with his wife Yoko Ono, and having broken through commercially with the huge singles Give Peace a Chance, Cold Turkey and Instant Karma, Lennon seemed fully primed for a long career. With his debut solo LP, the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album, he teamed up with producer Phil Spector to create a stark masterpiece that confirmed him as a formidable solo talent.
In my opinion, you know, some people say, oh, there's 4 or 5. I like everything on that record. And the things that I really like, things like God and Mother, I adore. And then the rest I think is wonderful because I think the music is wonderful. And the odd thing is, isn't it, that it's, in a way, it's a very produced record. But I mean, really, Plastic on a Band is a work of genius. It really is. It's probably a work of insanity, too, but so what?
This apparent brilliance continued with the album Imagine the following year, and Lennon had successfully established himself as an artist now very distinct from the Beatles. McCartney, on the other hand, was struggling. Having been the driving force behind the Beatles during their final years, he had never wanted the liberation that Lennon so clearly craved, and left to his own devices, he felt lost. After 2 solo releases, in 1971 he decided to form another band, Wings, with ex-Moody Blues guitarist Denny Laine, drummer Denny Seiwell, and his wife Linda. Rather than rehearse for weeks to establish a group dynamic, he decided to rush record their first album in a 2-week period.
We were trying to be a band that could get a couple of grooves going. And it was all about getting the feels between me and Denny and Paul as, you know, bass, drums and guitar, and making it, you know, groove, basically. We weren't trying to be too clever, is what it is. And we just thought, well, this is like, you know, what's the difference between this, or, for example, than any other album that's sometimes done like this? One thing I can think about is maybe the Dylan Basement tapes or something, where, you know, they just went in there and came out with what they came and didn't touch it, you know. And it was fun. That's the main thing about it. It was fun, it wasn't pressure. You know, you're up there in Scotland, in the middle of nowhere. Nobody knows who you are, where you are, and we're not under the scrutiny of the press or anything like that. So we got into it pretty easily.
Yet many felt too easily. Upon its release, Wings' debut, Wildlife, drew heavy criticism for its ramshackle compositions and its lack of polish. And following McCartney's low-key and lo-fi first album and the follow-up Ram, which divided opinion, his post-Beatles output was failing to live up to expectations.
They're all a bit fragmented and bitty, and he's doing too many records and not enough of them have quality moments on them. And if you compare it with what Lennon was doing with Plastic Ono Band, big statement. I mean, Wildlife comes out at the same time as Imagine, so he's been outflanked commercially by John Lennon as well at this point, which nobody could have envisaged. And we all thought, well, the one thing McCartney's going to do is he's going to be, you know, consistently commercially successful. And of course he was to a small degree, but nothing like he could have been. And the idea that, you know, that Lennon would be outselling him at this particular point, if not at any other time, but at this crucial point where he's 3 albums in and Lennon's suddenly doing Imagine, I mean, you know, Lennon must be thinking, well, you know, I'm the commercial tunesmith here. Look at what Paul's just done again. And it is quite odd when you look back. I mean, there's always something wonderfully self-destructive, I think, about it when you look back. That you know, Paul McCartney presumably must have some awareness that he can do a lot better than this.
Despite the negative reaction to Wildlife, McCartney quietly pressed on the following year with establishing his new band. Lennon's fortunes were to change after the release of the seminal Imagine album, however. Having moved with Yoko to New York in 1971, he had immediately been embraced by the radical left and the more overtly political elements of the counterculture. And although this may have been personally fulfilling, it damaged his musical output, with the '72 album Sometime in New York City failing both critically and commercially.
In 1972, Lennon was on an agitprop kick. Off-the-peg radicalism inspired by his yippie friends, and not very interesting songwriting. Quite powerful messages, a bit naive, but in the end he didn't make a good record. Sometime in New York City was considered a disappointment. He would renounce it himself. He didn't really believe his radical stance in retrospect. So it was all a little disappointing for Lennon in '72. McCartney, on the other hand, has started a new band, and it started a bit rockily. Wildlife is not a great record, but he's getting back to his roots. He wants to play again, so he takes this band on the road and hits the university circuit unannounced. In fact, refused to do a couple of the university gigs that he turned up for if he found out they'd got wind of it too early and had pre-announced it. He would then drive away to the next one who didn't know he was coming. He was keeping it very low-key because he knew the band was still finding his feet. Couple of very odd singles from McCartney in '72. Give Ireland Back to the Irish, a spur-of-the-moment decision to make a political statement, and then within months, a kid's song, Mary Had a Little Lamb. That dichotomy, that fantastic extreme, sums up just how willful McCartney was being at the time. You know, take a young band on the road with his wife who can't play keyboards, make a kid's song, make a political song. It's all the same to him, you know. He's just going to get on with it in '72.
It was during 1973, however, that McCartney's new outfit would make good on their potential. Wings had been working in the studio since March 1972, both in Los Angeles and in London, and despite the critical drubbing that Wildlife and the band's subsequent singles had received, by the end of the year they had achieved a notable success with their double A-side Sea Moon and Hi Hi Hi. As a sign of things to come, the first release from these sessions in 1973 propelled the band to the top of the charts in the US, and became their first real hit, the soulful ballad, My Love. Although this track almost single-handedly restored McCartney's waning reputation, the band themselves were unaware of its commercial potential.
We'd been together a while, and we were having a great time. We were very in love. And I sat down at the piano, and I was thinking about, Mom, our thing, you know. And it just came out. It was a love song to her.
It was never meant to be a single, and it was only Pete Bennett, who was the PR man at the time, started out with Elvis actually, went through the Alan Klein camp and that whole thing with the Stones and the Beatles, and then Wings, who talked Paul into putting it out as a single, because he's an older guy and who thought, oh, that's a lovely song. Paul went, well, I don't think so, you know, it's a bit slow, it's a love song, it's a bit twee maybe, you know, and he wasn't trying to be a rocker maybe, I don't know. But anyway, put it out, and it was huge.
I thought, great song. I know you love Linda. This is not a rocker. good ballad. I love ballads anyway, but I thought it was great, but I didn't think that it was going to have the effect that it did.
And when I go away, I know my heart can stay with my love. It's understood, it's in the hands of my love. And my love does it good.
Wildlife was a surprise for people because it was such a raw album. It was deeply maligned at the time when it came out. People just hated it. Whereas when My Love was released, I think definitely that pop sound, it was very, it had a lovely melody, it was well produced, and it had that just astonishingly cool guitar solo in the middle of it by Henry McCullough. And all those things taken together, I think, were just striking enough for people to think that this kid had a future after all.
Matter of fact, Henry and I played the Beatle Fest in Liverpool, and I hadn't seen Henry since the Wing days, you know. And we played My Love, and it was, I just get goosebumps thinking about it. It was brilliant. It was just, Henry was, you know, Linda was gone, and that was the song that kind of took Henry out of the band. And he played that guitar solo just like he played it on the record, but better. It had more feeling. Both of us had tears in our eyes. It was just like one of those very, very special moments in time, you know.
At the end of April, Wing's second album, Red Rose Speedway, was released. Abandoning the improvisational approach to recording that had in part earned Wildlife such bad press, McCartney and the group had spent months on their new material, aided by engineers Andy Parsons and Glyn Johns. It made the top 10 in the UK and reached the #1 spot in America, and was an album with which the band, if not the music press, were far more satisfied.
With that Red Rose Speedway situation, it was that the band had developed like as players, and we could bounce off one another more. You know, there was no nervousness there. You know, we weren't kind of like you've just met, you know, we better not try too hard here, you know, or we better just be cool. We'd opened up by then.
We had become a band, and it was a different animal than Wildlife, totally. And some days it wouldn't take 4 or 5 hours to get a track. It might take 12 hours. But when we would be finished and satisfied with the basic track for it, it would also be a little different than just some studio musicians that are very competent, you know. And I wanted to make that shift too, from just being that guy that can go in and nail it immediately, to let it evolve and let it grow into something that's got more of a personality and more of a that band, that certain thing that bands have. You know, it's hard to put a word on that one.
There's certain songs on there, Big Barn Bed, that I can remember as being really good grooves, you know. And also, the guys in the band at that time, Henry McCulloch and Denny Sowell, were great musicians too. You know, they were really good. And the development of Henry's solos and you know, I mean, Denny, you can just watch Denny Sowell play the drums and go, you know, wow, he's got all that feel and technique and just on his own. And that's what comes across to me on that album. We sounded like we were more polished.
It's one of those records that, for some reason, I don't connect with it as much as I do a lot of the other Wings records. And in a strange way, the songs I like on Wildlife, I like way more than the songs I like on Red Rose Speedway. Wildlife at least came with a sense of mission and a sense of excitement about this new band and working totally off the cuff, and had a very sort of sweet, you know, acoustic sound to it. And some very lovely singing. Whereas Red Rose Speedway, it seems more like product along the way. You know, it seems like, you know, I like Big Barn Bed and Single Pigeon. It's got some sweet moments in it too. But the medley at the end I find to be, you know, unlike the Abbey Road medley or other songs that Paul would eventually turn into medleys, it just doesn't have a real through line that I can connect with. And I find the songs just to be kind of forgettable.
Red Rose Speedway does not stand up as a great album. It's just that it had this mega hit on it, My Love. It was a #1 album in America because of the single. And ironically, the pace of releases, which gave the Beatles such a great catalog in such a short period of time, meant in the early 70s that every one of them put out more tracks than they really should have. But even with Paul at some kind of low period where he's trying to reposition himself, and I mean that seriously, as a person as well as a pop star, you get McCartney, Ram, Wings Wildlife, Red Rose Speedway, an album a year. What we were doing basically was watching them try to find themselves in public.
And that would prove to be an uphill battle. Despite the band's increasing solidarity in the studio, the music press refused to view Wings seriously as a long-term proposition, convinced that a Beatles reunion was imminent. Further attempts to establish a recognizable public image with both an hour-long TV special and a high-profile British tour were partly successful in highlighting that McCartney was now a member of Wings and not the Beatles. Yet this new collective, with its patchy discography, were inevitably compared unfavorably to a band that had revolutionized the whole of popular music.
You can't compare something because he's not the, you know, it's not that. It's just they're comparing him. How is he performing now as opposed to when he did that? Or is his song as good as that song? We were specifically trying to be something different. That's it. So whether the press expected it to be, you know, as good as it, well, that's silly anyway. I mean, the Beatles are the Beatles. Wings was another thing. Paul was in it. I was in it. I was from the Moody Blues. Again, we're going forward. We're not going backwards. We don't want to be criticised for being, you know, trying to produce the past. So therefore, we didn't have that problem. Our mentality was, no problem.
What their critics could not have known, however, was that McCartney's band were about to become one of the biggest acts of the decade. And despite the lukewarm reception to Red Rose Speedway, the band's next single, released in June, would again hit the top of the US charts and become an enduring composition. Written and recorded in October 1972 as the theme for the 8th James Bond film, Live and Let Die reunited McCartney with Beatles producer George Martin, and their familiarity with each other's working methods meant that they could record quickly and effectively.
We knew, the band knew our parts. George wrote the orchestra parts. We recorded it live with the orchestra in Air London and George Martin's studio, and did a couple of takes to make sure that all the notes were right. And then we did a couple of takes, and that was it. We were in and out of there They slammed vocals on there and mixed it up, and it was like done in a matter of 3 or 4 hours.
George is part of the package with the Beatles that they couldn't do without after a while. And to bring him in on something like that, especially orchestrations, which was his forte, you're adding a trained classical composer, conductor, you know, expert in that field at EMI Studios, to something that we are, which is not that. We are more, with the band, so you get a combination of things there that you need George to do. You've got to have somebody like that to do it.
I was there when Paul wrote it, though, and that was the amazing part. Because he said, yeah, they sent me the book, the Ian Fleming novel, I gotta read this. They want me to write the main title for it. I went, cool. So he read it, and the next day we're up at the house, and he's sitting around, he goes, James Bond, do-do-do. You know, he started do-do-do, do-do-do. 10 minutes later, 10 minutes later, the whole song was together. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. It was pretty amazing. It might be a little more than 10 minutes, but it did not take very long to craft that song.
When you were young and your heart was an open book, you used to say, live and let live. You know you did, you know you did, you know you did. But if this ever-changing world in which we live in makes you give in and cry, say live and let die. Live and let die. Live and let die. Live and let die.
McCartney's willingness to put himself in different contexts, like to do a James Bond theme like Live and Let Die, you know, which has, you know, it exists independent of that movie. I mean, you don't have to know that there's a movie called Live and Let Die to really enjoy that song. At the same time as if you do know, there's a great sort of cinematic quality. There's that element of chase and fun that I think people associate with those songs. And so it was really a kind of ideal marriage.
What you have is the return of McCartney, the grown-up pop musician, as opposed to the guy who's going to put a new band together or get a bunch of session musicians in and see what happens. This was a real commission. This was the Bond theme, and he wasn't going to mess around with this. So who's he going to call? The guy who helped him make all that great music in the 60s, he's got to call George Martin. And I think at that moment you can see, McCartney can go and do what he needs to do, what we all expect him to do, which is make great, grown-up, glossy, impressive pop music. And just to be on the safe side, he's going to get his old mate to help him along.
Like My Love, Live and Let Die confirmed Wings had potential, even if they had yet to release a satisfying album. And where McCartney was stubbornly sticking to the task of developing his band, Lennon entered 1973 very much in retreat. The re-election of Richard Nixon in November '72 led him to cut his ties with the radical arm of the counterculture with whom he had been so closely linked. And although his politics hadn't changed, he was consciously distancing himself from any activist links that could threaten his life in the USA. In March, he was ordered to leave the country within 60 days, and despite his successful appeal, this arduous battle with the US authorities would drag on until 1976. And where the bedrock of Lennon's stability since leaving the Beatles had been Yoko Ono, strains in their relationship had begun to develop.
Lennon in '73 was a bit of a lost soul. He certainly spent the first half of the year just recovering from the fact that Nixon had been re-elected, and he was drinking too much, and he wasn't getting on terribly well with Yoko. And sometime in New York City had been a bit of an embarrassment in the end. And I think he got to the point where he had to decide who he was and what next. And he decided who he was a musician. So for the first time, he just hires the studio, hires the best guys in New York he can get a hold of. He doesn't have Phil Spector holding his hand. He doesn't have Yoko holding his hand. It's just him and the guys and his songs, and he makes a record.
Recording quickly at New York's Record Plant Studios in July and August 1973, with the album Mind Games, Lennon intended to make a more accessible record after the heavy-handed politics of Sometime in New York City. The title track was issued as a single in mid-November, and despite very positive reviews, it failed to ignite the charts, reaching only 18 in the US and not even hitting the top 20 in the UK. Later that month, the album was released and similarly underperformed, and it seemed that Lennon's commercial appeal had begun to wane.
Out the blue you came to me.
I felt Mind Games was terribly anticlimactic. A situation made 10 times worse by the fact that the title track was one of the best things he'd done in quite a while. It was, you know, it wasn't as good as the Plastic Ono Band, but it was redolent of the best songs from that era as well. The song Mind Games was inspired by Robert Masters and Gene Houston's book Mind Games, which is a book about consciousness raising. That intrigued Lennon sufficiently to use words from it. So we had things like mind gorillas and the karmic wheel, and this all sounded terribly exotic and rather lyrically quite sophisticated and odd. And I don't think I knew what it meant, but it sounded great. What also sounded great about it was the production, which sounded like Spectre-esque, but as it turns out, it was just a bit of double tracking and Lennon playing this slide. It sounded like an orchestra enveloping the whole thing. But it had a wonderful lilt to it, and it was a really strong song. The trouble was with the album, Mind Games is about it. I mean, there's one other political song in it called Bring on the Lucy, which is pretty good, you know, fist-raising stuff, but the rest of it is very, very bland. They're just pithy little, you know, numbers that are detached from his reality. They're nothing to do with John Lennon, it seems, you know, tight ass and stuff like that. It's just Lennon doing songwriting by numbers. You know, it's not far removed from what McCartney was doing at in the early 70s. I mean, the songs are actually slightly better constructed than the stuff on Wildlife, for instance, not quite as fragmentary. But they are very like the complete opposite of what Lennon said a song should be about, because Lennon's songs were all about inspiration, creativity. They weren't about formula, and all these songs, most of the songs that album sounded terribly formulaic.
I think Mind Games has been given unfair press over the years. Certainly at the time it was received a little disappointedly. Now, why would that be? Lyrically, there's a sense of maybe one too many fragrant apologies to his wife for his bad behaviour, and we've heard that sort of stuff before. And it's getting more and more kind of purple as it goes. Asuma Sen is just a hanging dog of a track. He just lurches joylessly from chord to chord, saying, sorry, I'm really a bad man. And it's a bit wearying, that. But I think there's a lot elsewhere on that record to recommend it. To me, it's the sound of a musician getting in touch with the finer aspects of his craft. There's a track like Intuition, which just bounces along with a McCartney-esque, you might say, a McCartney-esque optimism and a sort of swing in its step and a sort of self-forgiveness. This is a guy saying, my intentions are good. I use my intuition. It takes me for a ride. That's quite self-affirming.
My intentions are good. I use my intuition. It takes me for a ride. But I never understood other people's superstitions. It seemed like suicide. As I play the game of life, I try to make it better each and every day. And when I struggle in the night, the magic of the music seems to light the way.
for a guy who's often, you know, using the word pain when he makes his own solo records, it's actually quite refreshing as well. It's nice to hear him sounding so healthy, and it's a really upbeat record. But I think the key tracks on that are Out the Blue and One Day at a Time. And I'll try and explain why they're interesting. Most pop songs gravitate around a single key. It's called the tonal center. So most songs, if it's Imagine, we're always going to come back to 1. So if we're in the key of C, all the chords are either ways away from C or ways back to C. There's no key change, in other words. Songs like One Day at a Time and Out the Blue, we go through myriad key changes, which in one way can be looked at as expressive of a man who doesn't actually know where he is, or in fact where he's going. But on the other hand, it's also expressive of a guy who has got great harmonic facility. And what a lovely reminder of that. This is a man who wrote Strawberry Fields and I Am the Walrus. And we'd kind of forgotten that he's the guy who did that, because he's been doing Mother and Woman is the Nigger of the World, very direct rock and roll, you know, and ballad songs. And then all of a sudden, he's rediscovered his harmonic opulence, and it's lovely. That's the verse in G. Chorus in E. He's just one day at a time, one chord at a time, one key at a time.
When we're together,
It's not that nobody else can do this, it's the fact that he has chosen not to do it for about 4 years. He was more interested in rock and roll and more direct music. And on Mind Games, we're reminded actually what a subtle composer he can be.
While Lennon was struggling with waning critical and commercial goodwill, Wings also seemed to be faltering. Having toured the UK in May and July to promote Red Rose Speedway and riding high in the charts with Live and Let Die, McCartney's perseverance in establishing recognition of the band members as a group and not as his session players did seem to be gradually paying off. But internally, this apparent collective harmony was breaking down, and during rehearsals for a new album, the group spirit began to erode.
We were all working on a hippie handshake. There was no contracts involved. And we were all working on retainers, a very small retainer. I was earning 1/10 of the money that I was used to earning, and I'd given up a really good career in New York. I mean, one of the top bands in the world, and you know, I borrowed money from the bank on the corner in South Ken to buy myself a used Mercedes convertible, you know, because I got tired of taking cabs, you know. But we weren't living high on the hog. In fact, I used to have to fly back to New York to do some dates and stuff just to be able to pay my American Express bill. And we were doing tours. And after tours, the European tours, we spent so much money on production and everything that we lost money on that tour, sold out tour. And when we left Scotland, Paul kind of pushed Henry into the corner. Henry was a very organic type of musician, and Paul pushed him into the corner one day. He needed to have him knuckle under and play the same part every time, and Henry just wasn't into that. He was a feel kind of guy. And we weren't getting paid right, and that happened, and Henry says, screw this, bollocks, I'm out. And he just pissed off.
It was a departure that would test the stability of the group itself. Wings were due to fly to the Nigerian coastal city of Lagos in August for the recording of the follow-up to Red Rose Speedway. And even without McCulloch, McCartney was unwilling to change these plans.
At that time, I kept calling Paul and asking him can't we just put Lagos off for a month and find another guitar player to replace Henry so we can go in there with that band vibe, you know. And he said, no, it's all set. I'm going to go through with this. We'll just do it like we did Rams, a whole bunch of overdubs. And at that point in time, I was saying, I just don't want to take a step back again. The money's not right. I thought about it for a couple of days and just picked up the phone and said, I can't do this either. I'm out of here.
I was disappointed because I really liked those two guys. They were good fun. And I got on great with them, you know. So, I mean, we had some laughs. We were a good bunch together. We had some good laughs. And, you know, I really enjoyed that lineup of Wings. They were my kind of people and great musicians. And I did miss them, I must say. When I went there, I thought, that's a drag. I was expecting Denny to turn up at that airport. And I was kind of disappointed, I must say. But I understood why they didn't want to go, you know.
And although some members of the press had long predicted a short lifespan for Wings, the departure of Sywell and McCulloch left a core of McCartney and Denny Laine, and upon their arrival in Lagos, this duo began to piece together a new album.
Wings, up to that point, had been a band. Wings now was just me, Paul and Linda. It was a completely different, same name, different vibe, you know. And I think because the pressure was on to do a good album, and because the time was booked, I mean, it sounds corny, but that's the way it was. We weren't going to go home, we were there. We'd already got the plane tickets, and we decided to go ahead with it. We just walked in, looked at the studio, and half of it wasn't like rigged up. It was kind of old-fashioned and old EMI equipment they'd got there but didn't know how to use. But we had Jeff Emmerich with us, who'd done all the Sgt. Pepper stuff. We kind of thought of it as maybe just as a duo, putting the music down. And we didn't compare the original rehearsals with what we were doing now. So Paul would go and play the drums, I would play the chords, and then we'd have something. We'd have a feel, you know, of two instruments. Then we would mess around and add the other stuff, not based on what Denny and Henry would have done. Again, it was an experimental situation. And so the album took on a completely different atmosphere. The ideas were completely different because now it's just two of us. And I wasn't thinking rehearsal, and he wasn't thinking rehearsal. It was a completely different direction. And it worked. And, you know, everybody liked that album because it was, I think it was thrown at us, you know. We had to go there. The studio was booked, and it was like, get on with it, you know. So we did.
This pared-down recording process also inspired Laine to introduce his own compositional ideas into Wings. Over the next few years, he would become the most significant musical accomplice for McCartney since the ex-Beatles' writing partnership with Lennon.
We'd got known as Paul's band more than, you know, a unit as writing-wise. I felt I wanted to, you know, be more of a writer myself, but how do I fit my writing into this band more, you know? So I had that thing with Paul where whatever I wrote, he could throw something in there good, and it would be something, you know, like, whoa, that's it. That works, you know. It's hard to keep Paul out of a song because he's so talented with that. He's so good at like doing the harmonies and working out a great bass part that he fills it out on his own, you know. His part on his own bass would be a great little part, you know. He's putting two parts together like that. It's not like he's just in the background adding a bit here. It's an actual full bit, you know. And that's what we had. We had that ability to like work together and each have our own thing, and it worked, you know.
Despite the pressures and problems involved in making the album, McCartney and Laine had unknowingly recorded Wings' seminal LP. Released only 4 weeks after Lennon's Mind Games, the reversal of fortunes couldn't have been more pronounced. Where the commercial and critical success of the Plastic Ono Band and Imagine had eclipsed anything McCartney had to offer at the start of their respective solo careers, the album culled from the Lagos sessions, Band on the Run, was hailed by many as the finest work to date by any of the ex-Beatles.
There might well have been in the back of his mind a bit of pressure that it was time to make a good record. They'd been faffing around in public for a while, and it wasn't a disaster, but there was always that sense that things were falling short. So maybe it was time to really hitch up your britches and be great again. But look at when he chose to do that, when two of his members had just quit. So he was really left with himself and his missus and a mate. And then he makes a great record.
Band on the Run is a fantastic record. It deserved the huge sales, and it deserves to sell in huge numbers now. I think in 40 years, I still think it's the strongest solo record Paul McCartney, or post-Beatles record that Paul ever made. The sense of desperation that went into it, the fact that 40% of the band had split, in the weeks before they were going down to Nigeria to make this record, which turned out to be, and then Nigeria itself turned out to be a real grim and unhospitable place to make a record. And a lot of things went wrong, but I mean, Paul had everything to prove at that point, and very coolly took it on his shoulders and took a lot of this sort of attendant anxiety I think that he had about the state of his solo career, and transformed it into this beautifully wrought collection of songs.
Fly away through the midnight air as we head across the sea, and at last we will be free. You're a bluebird, you're a bluebird, you're a bluebird, you're a bluebird, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're a bluebird, you're a bluebird, you're a bluebird, yeah, yeah, yeah. Bluebird.
It's the finest example thus far in McCartney's solo career of this extended thinking that he was encouraged to do for the second half of Abbey Road by George Martin, when George Martin would encourage them to think symphonically, boys. Well, what he meant was motivic development and recapitulation and things that techniques that will make it sound like a larger thing. And he's sort of dabbled with this since we had that medley at the end of Red Rose Speedway, which ended up actually being less than the sum of its parts because the individual songs weren't that interesting, and they certainly didn't deserve the kind of extra scrutiny a sweet form gave them. But what we've got with Band on the Run is him thinking a little more thematically and a little more expansively and much more successfully. So right from the word go, you've got the title track, which is in 4 distinct parts.
Stuck inside these 4 walls, sent inside forever, never seeing no one nice again, like you.
You've got the Stuck Inside These 4 Walls section, followed by a new key, a minor key of If We Ever Get Out of Here section, followed by the little riff that connects us into the next part. So we've had 3 sections, and those 3 musical elements are not repeated. It's almost like they are different sections of a suite, which then introduces the actual song, the Band on the Run song, which is then played to the end of the piece. That's really unusual structure in pop music. I know, 1973, 74, we're right in the middle of the prog rock era, but McCartney's a pop musician. And so he's just taking advanced structures and making them work in a pop context. So right from the word go, Band on the Run gives us that. Throughout the rest of the album, we hear self-referential motifs all the time. In the middle of Picasso's last words, we are referenced back to Jet. At the end of 1985, we go banging back into the chorus of Band on the Run. So the whole thing is sort of wrapped up. He understands that's what they liked about the second side of Abbey Road. It was wrapped up. I referred back to what I did earlier, and it gives it a real cohesive feeling.
I can almost remember the funny faces. That time you told them that you're gonna be married soon. Yes, I thought the only road that leads was on.
The album's got great hard rocking songs on it, like Let Me Roll It and Jet. Jet is a breathtaking song, to my mind. And Let Me Roll It is a very puckish kind of tribute to John and his Arthur Janov primal scream mode. The drum sound comes right out of John's Plastic Ono Band album, and the guitars are turned up so loud you can hear, I don't know if it's Paul or Denny Lane's fingers touching the strings even without strumming them, It's coiled, it's full of energy and passion and just a little bit of attitude. It's a return to form, but on the other hand, if your form is Paul McCartney from the Beatles, that brings along with it, I think, the implicit acknowledgement that his form is to be an innovative, brilliant songwriter, and that's what that Band on the Run is.
Yet it was a slow burner, and it took 2 #1 singles in the US to propel the album to the top spot. While in the UK it didn't reach #1 until July 1974, 8 months after its release. The reaction from the music press was virtually unanimous, however. Band on the Run was a masterpiece, and even a publication like Rolling Stone, which had previously reviewed McCartney's post-Beatles work with a scathing disdain, celebrated his return to form and made the LP Album of the Year.
I think the critical reaction to Band on the Run represented 2 things. One, a general thawing of the media antipathy towards McCartney in general since the split up of the Beatles, bearing in mind that he was perceived as the guy who had broken up the Beatles and indeed sued the Beatles. So any work he was going to be doing in the immediate aftermath of that was going to be regarded in that light. And the second thing is that it was actually the best thing he'd done for 4 years. And so everyone could gush. 1, we don't dislike him anymore because he broke up the Beatles. 2, he's done really good work. And that was just enough to open the floodgates of, oh, he's back, the genius is back. We always knew he was. We always knew he had it in him. There we are, there's the proof.
While McCartney's career outside of the Beatles was finally living up to expectations, Lennon's was drifting in unexpected directions. In the summer of 1973, while working on Mind Games, he had separated from Ono, and at her suggestion had taken their personal assistant, May Pang, as a new companion. In October, the pair moved to Los Angeles, where Lennon sought to reignite his inspiration through new recording projects. One of these was in the role of producer for Harry Nilsson's Pussycats album, which led Lennon and Pang to rent a beach house in Santa Monica. Unshackled from the trappings of his marital life, he surrounded himself with old friends and musicians and set off down the road of excess.
We stayed in a house all together. John with May Pang, Keith Moon with a girlfriend, Ringo, Jesse Ed Davis lived pretty close. It was in Santa Monica. You've got the Pacific Ocean, Santa Monica, and there's Venice. And Venice is right next to it. So Jesse Ed Davis always came over to the house. So we played pool and had food. Some Cuban people were cooking for us. It was like being back in the Hamburg days when John was frustrated. He was frustrated, and he was, in a way, he felt, I'm free now, but he had lost the touch to the ground. He took off. Okay, he was free from Yoko, but he was not happy. A hell of a lot of drinking. Well, you're just crazy, and Harry is just as crazy. And if he has a partner like John, they just go off, and there's no holding them. They're smashing stuff and abusing people and doing whatever, you know, just terrible. But fun, you know, they're having a great time in a way, but it's because you're frustrated. That's when you do those things.
Yet despite the frustration and pent-up tension let loose during Lennon's legendary drinking bouts, May Pang's influence on him was far from negative. She encouraged him to rebuild bridges burned during his time with Yoko, including a reconciliation with his son, Julian, and significantly, a chance to heal old wounds with McCartney. At the end of March 1974, while sessions were taking place at Burbank Studios for Nilsson's album, the legendary songwriting duo were to meet again and record together for the last time. The jam session that resulted would remain unheard by the public for 20 years.
It's arguable that it would have happened at all had John still been with Yoko. But then he was in a different place in '74. He was in LA, he had a different girlfriend, he was hanging out with musicians. The idea of McCartney dropping around for a jam with some mutual acquaintances isn't terribly surprising, and in the end, not terribly interesting. I mean, it's good to hear, but, you know, only if you're really interested.
Hands up who doesn't know Stand By Me. Arm in the air. Okay. We all know it, right? Just turn the fucking vocal mic up. McCartney's doing the harmony on the drums. Stevie might get on it there if he's got a mic. All right. That's just like more vocal, treble. Come on. Still dead in the earphones. All right. Whoa, still a bad sound. Treble. Oh, yeah. Let's hear it. If you stand by me. When the night has come. I can't hear a fucking thing now. I can't hear a thing.
As the final thing that Lennon and McCartney can be heard on playing together, it's a shabby end, but it's not that important.
Far more interesting, however, were the compositions that Lennon had been penning since the inception of his relationship with May Pang. And in June 1974, the couple returned to New York with many of the musicians who had been living with them in Santa Monica to record this new collection of songs. In September, a matter of weeks after McCartney and Wings had topped the US singles charts with Band on the Run, the first single issued from Lennon's new album, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, also went to #1. The single, prominently featuring Elton John, was followed in October by the LP Walls and Bridges. Although this record was critically and commercially successful, Lennon himself would later dismiss it, and indeed the entire period that he spent with May Pang in Los Angeles, a year and a half that he would refer to as his lost weekend.
This Lost Weekend saga is a bit of a mystery, isn't it? Once he was back in the womb, and with Yoko in the Dakota having babies and baking bread, he would look back on that period as hell on earth. The worst thing he could have ever done with 18 months of his life, hanging out with musicians, drinking too much, with a new girlfriend. making records that were the work, in his words, of a semi-sick craftsman. So in retrospect, history looks at that period as the lost weekend. But the evidence is he actually made a really good record in Walls and Bridges.
Walls and Bridges may well be, I think probably is, apart from Sometime in New York City, is probably Lennon's most underrated album in a sense. Its stylistic range is exceptional and possibly even unprecedented on a Lennon solo release. Songs like Scared and Bless You really get to the heart of Lennon's problems at the time. Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out is a great song of Been in the Gutter. Old Dirt Road with Jesse Ed playing the bottle is almost like a Delta blues song. The overall theme in that record is of Lennon superficially seeming at the, seemingly been at the end of the bottle, because this coincides with the whole Lost Weekend, and the whole image of that album is it's an articulation of Lennon's Lost Weekend, that he's completely lost soul. But if you listen to the record, far from it. There's a wonderful defiance within many of those songs on that record.
Whatever gets you through the night, it's alright, it's alright. If your money or your life, it's alright, it's alright. Don't need a salt to drop through flowers, oh no, whatever gets you through your life, it's alright, it's alright.
If you move into a Whatever Gets You Through the Night, for instance, listen to the lyrics and it's quite obviously a cry for help, but it's one of the most exuberant songs that Lennon's ever recorded. It's one of the most upbeat songs he's ever recorded. If this is a cry for help, it's a cry from somebody who seems to be pretty well enjoying himself at the time, and in that sense it probably perfectly articulates what the Lost Weekend was about.
Hold it, darling, come on, listen to me. I won't do you no harm. Trust me, darling, come on, listen to me. Come on, listen to me. Come on, listen.
I think Walls and Bridges is a really, really strong record that history misrepresents. Beautifully played, beautifully sung, and really well produced. Whatever he was writing about lyrically, he was still taking his musical craft very seriously. Certainly the presence of Nicky Hopkins brings a signature sound back, which was absent on Mind Games. So you didn't have that distinctive piano tinkle that is reminiscent of Imagine. So in that sense, what you have is the best of both worlds. You have the signature sound of Nicky Hopkins' sound, you've got Klaus Voormann back on bass, but you've also got crack session guys, Jesse Ed Davis and Jim Keltner, of course, and no Phil Spector. Just really professional guys, and John Lennon being very focused about what he's going to get out of them. Number 9 Dream is an interesting record for a few reasons. One of them is what we've touched on earlier in relation to his harmonic dexterity and opulence. There's no doubt about it. It's in 3 different keys. The chords seem to balance a surprising quality with a satisfying quality, and it's a really nice balance to strike. This is, again, Lennon right in tune with his finer compositional instincts. Even rhythmically, he's taking chances. At the end of the chorus, this chorus which is just nonsense syllables, and yet somehow manages to uplift any listener who hears it, he drags the whole thing down to this sort of marvellous rallentando in which you get back home in the original key. That's very elegant stuff.
John didn't want to record that song. And he said, something is missing, I don't like it. And I said, why don't we do a part in the middle where it gets very dreamy, So no drums going through, just a real break, and you do it real simple and easy. And he tried it and he said, that's great, it works. So we got that number 9 Dream done. So it's always like this, you have an idea, he has the song, and sometimes he said, well, I don't know, it doesn't work. And then you start putting in, you doing your input, which is a great way to work. I mean, of course, didn't write the song and I don't get any royalties. I'm just the guy who was asked to play the bass, but never worked like this. It always worked that we contributed whatever we could do to make this thing work. We were very anxious.
Number 9 Dream is fascinating. It was instantly recognised as being a very, very strong Lennon track. Perfect single. Again, deserved number 1, didn't get it. This is the work of a semi-sick craftsman, and we're all thinking, well, if this is, stay sick. This kicks mind games completely out the window in terms of on every level of quality and musical invention and everything else. It's one of the great undiscovered ones. Even though it had had the number 1 on it, it seems to have been sort of forgotten. I think largely because Lennon himself has dismissed it so much for political reasons, personal political reasons as much as anything.
Lennon's flurry of activity over the past year and a half began to slow down by the end of 1974, before it would finally grind to a halt. In November, he joined Elton John on stage at his Thanksgiving concert at Madison Square Garden, performing the number 1 hit, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and 2 Beatles numbers. Perhaps significantly, one of these was I Saw Her Standing There, a track he dedicated to its principal songwriter, Paul McCartney. Backstage after the concert, he met with Ono, and this moment seems to have been decisive in their reunion. Despite Lennon's apparent contentedness with May Pang, Yoko wanted her husband back in her life, and had even called on the help of unexpected allies to arrange this meeting.
It's funny, you think Yoko is in command, but at the same time, I had moments like this where you suddenly feel she's very vulnerable herself. Like there's one thing when she wanted to get back somehow to John, he wanted to get a message. So she got Paul told me this, Paul to be the communicator. Yoko actually went up to Paul and asked if he could do something about it if John wasn't going to come back. And Paul actually did this. He called John and talked to him about it. And he is actually the reason that the two got back together. Interesting, isn't it? I found that very interesting.
And as Lennon prepared to re-enter married life, a project long in gestation was finally being prepared for release. The album Rock and Roll, a collection of cover versions of classic material from the Golden Age, had seen Lennon go through a tumultuous set of sessions in LA in late 1973, and an entire re-recording of the material in New York a year later before a finished LP was ready. Yet even the conception of this album was a compromise.
The idea of it was almost accidental. I mean, it came out as a result of Lennon being sued over Come Together. The music publisher Morris Levy, who owned Chuck Berry's back catalogue, said Come Together plagiarises Chuck Berry. And this legal action dragged on and on and on, and Lennon, I think, was hoping it would go away, but it clearly was not going to go away because, Morris Levy, with his mafia connections and legal prowess, wasn't going to allow it to go away. And eventually a sort of settlement was reached in the sense that Lennon said he'd do 3 songs on his next album. And that felt, well, if I'm doing 3 rock and roll songs from the back catalogue of Morris Levy and those rock and roll, why don't I do an album of rock and roll songs? And actually, it wasn't a bad idea because, I mean, David Bowie had a lot of success of it with pin-ups, and even Brian Ferry, of all people, with These Foolish Things, got actually good press out of it. So it wasn't, it wasn't that strange a thing to do. The problem was, as Lennon later said, he got involved with the psychodrama. The psychodrama, incidentally, was named Phil Spector. The Spector sessions have we hardly need to dwell on them because they've gone down in rock and roll legend for their drunkenness, for their complete chaos, culminating in Spector allegedly confiscating the tapes or just going off of them, and that was then a big problem for Lennon because he had to go back to Morris Levy, and he's got a problem. He hasn't got an album.
The tapes were recovered, however, and in October '74, Lennon reassembled the musicians who had recently worked on Walls and Bridges to complete the tracks. Issued in February 1975, the album was released amidst more drama, involving rough mixes of the tracks being simultaneously made available by Morris Levy via mail order, and a project that had begun as a compromise to avoid legal action ironically ended up with the two parties in court anyway. The album itself performed respectably, both commercially and critically, and its lead single, Stand By Me, was issued in tandem with press releases announcing Lennon's return to Ono. Many, however, felt disappointed with rock and roll's fairly pedestrian versions of classic material.
The problem I have with it is that it came a little bit too late. It should have preceded Walls and Bridges, and it would have been perfectly placed during that period, because this was the period after Mind Games, and Lennon was a bit lost. And I think in that search for salvation, as it were, he did what many people would do, which is travel back to the origins of the Beatles, just as Paul McCartney had suggested they do with Let It Be, where we'll go back and be the rock and roll group again, then we'll find our way forward. And this is something that he was doing then. I found myself liking the songs I didn't know so well on it, which I think is most people's reaction. I mean, it's a problem with doing cover versions. You either have to be remarkably original with them, as Joe Cocker was with A Little Help from My Friends or something, where you do it radically different. But that's very difficult to do in rock and roll. And the difficulty then becomes, if it's just pastiche, you'll always prefer the original. I mean, who wants to hear somebody else doing Elvis when you can hear Elvis? Who wants to hear somebody doing Jerry Lee or Little Richard when you can hear the originals, or even Buddy Holly for that matter? Unless it's an obscure song and you don't know it so well. And the one that worked best was, of course, Lloyd Price's Just Because none of us knew what that was. And that really did sound excellent.
For a guy who was an avowed rocker, it is a bit of a letdown, really. It's hard to know why, because the singing isn't bad, and the playing isn't bad, and the songs are great. So why isn't it more exciting? Why doesn't it excite us a bit more to hear one of the greatest rock and roll singers ever singing some of the greatest rock and roll songs ever? The Spector tracks are obviously overblown, over-arranged, too long, and too slow. The big contractual obligation of recording You Can't Catch Me. Why would you take You Can't Catch Me, which isn't one of the more interesting Chuck Berry tunes anyway, and turn it into an elephantine 4.5 minutes at half the speed it should be? It just doesn't make any sense. There are a couple of successes. I think Sweet Little 16 is fantastic. It's a really grinding, grooving, rocking thing, and Lennon sings it great. But he also sings some pretty horrible things on there. I'm not even sure that the salvage job that he did in a couple of days was worth it. I mean, it's so hard to put your finger on. It's well played, it's pretty well sung, the songs are good, so why is it so uninteresting?
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. No, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you
think there's also a sense that by the time the album came out and Stand By Me was released as a single, and John has got back together with Yoko and announced on the same day that the single is released, there's a sense of, oh, we're back there then, are we? It's back to that. There's just a little sense of deflation about that. I don't know why we should care, because obviously Yoko is very good for John Lennon in many ways, but on the evidence of something like a Yoko-free Mind Games and a Yoko-free Walls and Bridges, you've got to ask yourself, was she always good for his music?
During Lennon's year and a half of turmoil, elation and productivity, McCartney's world was a far calmer affair. While numerous singles from Band on the Run hit the charts on both sides of the Atlantic during 1974, McCartney was in no rush to record the follow-up or to tour. After appearing at the Oscar ceremony, where Live and Let Die was nominated for Best Song, he instead began holding auditions for new players to replace the departed Sywell and McCulloch, still looking to make Wings a bona fide band. In the summer, having recruited guitarist Jimmy McCulloch and drummer Jeff Britton into the Wings fold, the group travelled to Nashville to work on fresh material. By the end of the year, the only original Wings composition to be issued in 1974 was released, the single Junior's Farm. Yet almost as soon as this latest lineup were recording, there were fresh tensions.
The thing about Jimmy was, he was a great little guitar player, and he was also a character. He was a pro. He was a good pro player. He'd been in Stone the Crows and Thunderclap Newman, and he'd already proved himself as being able to play and record, you know, and do live stuff.
Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go down to Junior's farm where I wanna lay low. Low life, high life, let's go. Take me down to Junior's farm. Take me down, Jimmy.
Wow, he was a great guitar player. And if you look at any of the Wings footage, you know, he never missed a trick, you know. You never heard a bum note out of Jimmy. He was always there, you know. Jimmy got the job. And he slotted in really well, actually. I mean, there's no problem with him. Jeff Britton wasn't really our cup of tea as the style of his lifestyle. As a drummer, he was a great drummer. Well, when he got in the gig and we went to Nashville to actually rehearse and we did Junior's Farm, a couple of things with him. His character wasn't right for us, simple as that, you know. He was a karate guy. He was into that. And he was like, what's this got to do with music, you know? That's how I felt about it. You know, there was too much of that influence for me. And it wasn't like being in a band so much, you know. But, you know, God bless him, was a good drummer. There's no getting away from that. The guy could really hit them, you know, get a good groove and everything. It was just a personality thing, I think.
In November 1974, recording began in London for a new Wings album. By January, these sessions had moved to Sea Saint Studios in New Orleans. Yet due to personal differences with the band, Jeff Britton quit. He was quickly replaced by New York drummer Joe English, who completed the album and became a full-time member of Wings. These recordings were also rumoured to have seen Lennon and May Pang join the band in New Orleans, and a potential collaboration which would have reunited the most famous songwriting duo in popular music. Yet it was not to be. Upon his return to Ono, Lennon's contact with McCartney was once again minimal. In May, the lead single taken from the New Orleans sessions, Listen to What the Man Said, continued Wings' success in the charts, hitting the top 10 in the UK and adding a further US #1 to their tally. Released 2 weeks later, the fourth Wings album, Venus and Mars, would become one of the biggest selling LPs of 1975, going platinum on both sides of the Atlantic. The music press, however, greeted it with a lukewarm reception, feeling that McCartney was underperforming again after the brilliance of Band on the Run.
one thing, it was a huge hit that had a bunch of hit singles on it, so that's not bad. And the hit singles were good. I think Listen to What the Man Said is one of the great underrated tunes of his career. Well performed, that incredible sax solo in the middle of it, which I think was a first take.
Take it away, Thaddeus.
I listen to that album fairly frequently, and I come back to it and I find that it's, in many ways a very satisfying record. I don't know, parts of it feel like a guilty pleasure to me, but there's still, undeniable pleasure in my ears when I listen to that record.
It's a good album. It's a consistent album, and there are some good McCartney songs on it. I think the problem was that it had to fight with Band on the Run, which was and still is perhaps McCartney's greatest work, and anything that came after it was going to pale into insignificance. But having said that, I mean, it's got Rock Show, which is a really great rocker. It's got Treat Her Gently, Lonely Old People, which is a nice romantic look at old age, which kind of harks back to When I'm 64. So it's a very interesting album, but perhaps not as good, perhaps not as strong as Band on the Run.
One level, Venus and Mars is a bit of a letdown, but it's not because it's not a great sounding record, because I think Venus and Mars is a great sounding record. It's just some of the songs are obviously the product of that particular half hour while Paul was writing a song about Magneto and Titanium Man. Some of these songs didn't need to be written, they didn't need to be out there. But what is always heartening about most of McCartney's records, when he comes to make the record, he usually makes a really good record. Now, the record of Magneto and Titanium Man, which is a sliver of a song, is fantastic. Fantastic vocal arrangements, fantastic rhythm section, great guitar playing, beautifully sung. Everything about it is done to a T.
Well, I was talking last night.
Why he would want to on a song like Magneto and Titanium Man might be a mystery, but the fact is that he does it, and that's why those Wings records always sound great, because at his heart, he's a craftsman who makes great records. He doesn't always take the trouble to write great songs, and he knows that, and I think he's almost accepted that over the years. Listening to Venus and Mars again, I wonder whether we just got on at him too much. Certainly the critics got on at him too much for not filling albums with compositional masterpieces. Actually, he did fill albums with masterpieces, but they were masterpieces of arranging often. And I think that's overlooked.
With Venus and Mars flying high in the charts, McCartney chose to take this new lineup of Wings on the road. And unlike previous tours, this would be a gargantuan operation, beginning in the UK in September '75 and heading to Australia for the end of the year. In January, the band returned to the studio to record their 5th album before heading off for an expansive European tour. Released in March 1976, 2 months before the band would take their show to the US, Wings at the Speed of Sound was very much a record made for a live arena. Although Venus and Mars had included a track featuring Denny Laine on lead vocals and a composition by new guitarist Jimmy McCulloch, this new LP featured compositions by both Laine and McCulloch, as well as lead vocals from Linda and drummer Joe English. This decision would divide audiences and critics, but showed McCartney's dedication to his original intention of making Wings a true band.
That album had to be something different. That difference was, let's get everybody singing. In a sense, he was thinking about that from the point of view of maybe the next tour is going to be slightly different, because now we're going to have somebody else singing there, and there's going to be more people singing solo, lead parts. Joe English, the good singer, got a song. I'll get a few more. And in other words, come up with something. And if they didn't come up with a song, Paul would write it for them.
If I have to run, I'm not running on you, babe. If I have to shake a little sand down my shoes, running from the Lord, oh, that put me inside, yeah. Baby, won't you let me have a little time to hide?
Well, certainly if you're going to take 5 Faces into the stadiums of America, it makes more sense for your show if they kind of have got a bit of an inkling of who they are. And if you've got a couple of lead vocals on the new Wings album, oh, this is the one Joe sings, this is the one Denny sings, you know, then that's going to help the identity of the band and the general Wingsness rather than Paul and his backing band feeling. And I think that worked in their favour. And I think it works in the favour of the album. I think the album holds together rather nicely. It's got a lovely soft rock feel about it. Everybody sings well. Joe English sounds a bit like McCartney, so it's okay. Denny Laine sings great. I think it holds together as a nice band album.
Spend a little time, happy to be by your side. Baby, won't you let me have a little time to hide?
You could say that they weakened the album, but the impulse was very generous on Paul's part, and it was a very interesting idea that he really was trying to establish Wings as something other than Paul McCartney and a bunch of other guys. You can criticize it, you know, artistically. There are parts where the record doesn't quite hold up, but it's an extraordinarily well-produced album, and the songs Paul writes, a lot of, you know, at least 2 or 3 of them are quite good. You know, it's definitely not anywhere near the plateau that Band on the Run is on, but it attests to his generosity, which I think often people question. And it attests to his commitment to the idea of a band. He was following through on promises he'd made, you know, many years earlier that this was going to be a democratic band. I don't know if it ever became a democratic band. I think if I was in that band and I've got Paul McCartney in the band, I'm going to defer to that guy pretty much all the time. But, you know, but it's not an embarrassment, as some others of his records would ultimately be.
Indeed, the album was far from embarrassing commercially. It became McCartney's most successful post-Beatles American chart LP. And the first single culled from the record and released the following month would be yet another US #1. Silly Love Songs was not only further proof of McCartney's golden touch commercially, it was also a sly riposte to critics who continued to dismiss his sentimental lyrics as banal and superficial.
To actually write a song that says, yes, I write silly love songs, it's all right, isn't it? Actually, you quite like this one as well, don't you? That's always been his point of view. I remember he wrote to Penny Valentine, who criticised his first solo album. And he said to her, well, you might think that now, but you know what? It'll grow on you. And he's been proved right again and again about that. I think he suffered from being in an atmosphere of antipathy towards him. And in 1976, to put out an unapologetic piece of saccharine pop in which he lays out his silly love song manifesto, and it's a massive hit. And does anyone dislike it? What's not to like about it?
You think that people would have had enough of silly love songs? But I look around me and I see it isn't so. Some people want to fill the world with silly love songs. And what's wrong with that? I'd like to know. 'Cause here I go again. I love you. I love you.
It's so unashamedly McCartney that it's just a great triumph, a great vindication.
Love doesn't come in a minute. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. I only know that when I'm in it, it isn't silly. Love isn't silly. Love isn't silly at all.
You'd think you would be sick of silly love songs, but what's wrong with that? I'd like to know. And I guess what's wrong with having a string of good quality radio singles which hit #1? You can't knock it. And I think that was quite a humble thing when he did that song. And it was, you know, the fact that he made it into a #1 as well really punctuated the point. I mean, that proved his case better than anything. So that song kind of says it all. It answers the question far better than any of us could.
And McCartney, on the back of 4 US #1 singles since the release of Band on the Run, finally took Wings to America. The 31 shows that he played on this leg of the Wings Over the World tour represented the first concert appearances he had made in the US since he had played with the Beatles in 1966. And the spectacular show not only took full advantage of Wings' success over the last 3 albums, but also the fact that the American public had been denied access to any of the ex-Beatles on a major tour for years.
He felt like he'd had enough good solo music and enough solo hits under his belt to really take it to the US and play that, you know, the biggest of all the markets. And suddenly they were a very powerful band. People forget that in the mid-70s, Wings was one of the 2-3 biggest bands in the world. I mean, you had the Stones, Led Zeppelin, and Wings, Paul McCartney's band. Because he was like the Beatles on the road. I mean, he was the most Beatle-y of all the Beatles, and there he was, back at the, you know, at the top of his game. And even though, you know, I think it's clear that he was much less artistically ambitious through the 70s than he'd been in the 60s, that he really stepped back and focused on being more of a pop performer, there was still beauty and transcendence to be found. And for a time there, you know, from Band on the Run through Wings at the Speed of Sound and then the live album after that, they were at the absolute apex of the pop music scene.
The concert began in the dark, and smoke machines filled the stage with fog. At 8:25, the lights came up, and there he was.
What was propelling Wings in the end was the fact that a Beatle was on tour, and all the excitement that was creating meant that Wings could ride into America on the wave of that. It's not a coincidence that it was on the Wings Over America tour that McCartney started singing Yesterday again, and I've Just Seen a Face, and a couple of other Beatles things. That in itself was news.
This one will take you back a bit, if you remember it. See how you go.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday. Suddenly,
I think that transformed McCartney as a live performer, and in the past, the idea of incorporating a Beatles tune was a heresy. It was, that those songs were sacrosanct. If John Lennon and George and Ringo weren't there, you didn't do them. And it was a tricky thing for him to get over as to whether it was politically correct almost to do it. But once he did do that, and when you see McCartney to the day, it's still a thrill. And one of the reasons it would be a thrill to see McCartney live is because he still performs Beatles songs which he wrote, and they are McCartney songs, and I think that kind of transformed everything for him as a live performer at that point.
why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say. I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday.
It could be that in retrospect, Wings were more successful than they actually deserved to be, given the quality of the music, the variable quality of the music that appeared under their name. But when they're being led by a Beatle who's taking them round on world tours and making news wherever he goes, then maybe it's not so surprising.
And riding on the back of the huge success of the shows, McCartney then holed up in the studio and trawled through over 90 hours of live recordings to compile the 3 LP set, Wings Over America. In December, it was released to huge sales, becoming the band's 5th consecutive #1 album in the US and going gold in the UK. In February, sessions began at Abbey Road for a new album. But when Linda fell pregnant, the band took their time with recording and relocated to a boat studio moored in the Virgin Islands. The band was struggling for inspiration, however, and on their return to McCartney's Scottish farmhouse with only half an album's worth of material, Joe English and Jimmy McCulloch quit the group. Despite the inclusive impulse of Wings at the Speed of Sound, both felt that they didn't have enough input into proceedings and that their talents were being wasted. Once again, Wings was reduced to a trio of the McCartneys and Lane.
I was rung up one morning by Steve Marriott, a good singer, and he said, oh, me and Jimmy have been up all night and he's decided he wants to join me and leave the group. And so I was a little bit sort of, put out, but I said to him, hey, good luck, guys, and I'll see you, Jim.
Paul was very, very famous, probably the most famous person in the world. You're up against that. It's just a natural phenomenon that you have to deal with. And so therefore, there can't be that equality that you think being in the band is all about, But even in any band, even an unknown band, there's always one person or two people that run the band. Whether it be like Freddie Mercury and Brian May or, Paul and John, Mick and Keith. There's always that, or Brian in the old days. But, it's kind of equality comes from what you want to put into it, I would think. And like I say, I knew I would never be as famous because I wasn't in the Beatles as Paul. But, I certainly pulled my weight as far as like being in Wings and as much as I possibly could. Hey, if I'd have wanted to write more songs and get them in there, I would have. I think a lot of it was the fact that they made money. They certainly made money. And, wanted to go off and do their own things. Once you made money, that's kind of a natural thing. Oh, well, now I can go and afford to do what I really want to do. I mean, it's a kind of life, To bring anyone else in after, was difficult. You see what I mean? We had that identity. And then Joe English went off and did his thing, which is more of a religious thing. Again, wanted to take some time off from being in the big time, if you like. But again, it was the three of us after that. I mean, we promoted it. Just the three of us promoted London Town. So, I mean, it went from that band to this and then the trio again. It was like, juggling. But, you know, it still always ended up with the three of us doing our own thing in between bands. That's the way I see it.
Yet Lane's commitment to Wings led to an even greater involvement in the songwriting for the forthcoming album, and also on a standalone single that would become the band's biggest UK hit. In August, shortly after the departure of McCulloch and English, McCartney came to Lane with the skeletal chord structure of Mull of Kintyre.
I go over to Paul's house for breakfast, which is kind of the norm. He says, I got this idea, and it was the chorus. I mean, that was the song as far as I'm concerned. I said, that's great. When are we doing it? See you tomorrow, 3 o'clock, you know, and we sat down on the porch and then we wrote the words. And then we kind of worked out the arrangements a little bit. It's 3 chords, you know, for Christ's sake. It was dead easy. It was just 3 chords, but it was the words that were important. And then it was, oh great, we'll get bagpipes on it, and that will give it the Scottish feel. It's a song about Scotland. And anyway, when we came to put the actual pipes on, the drone of the pipes was in a different key to the way we've written it. It was actually in the D where we'd written it in the A. And so we had to transpose to the D for the pipes to come in. Okay? That was just a complete, well, fate. It was just you know, it was like we didn't plan it. So, you know, they're all going, oh yeah, well, you've got to have the pipes, hey, they can't do that, you know. I said, well, we'll transpose it up to there then. So that gave the song another lift because we had to work to the pipes. And then when the pipes went down to just a drone, we could then go down to A and we could stay in that. Then we could bring it back up. So it's all about the arrangement and changing it and not being boring. And it was a long song too. And they also recorded the pipes actually live outside in the mountains and, you know, outside of the studio. And it worked, you know.
The single, released in November, became a chart phenomenon. A Christmas #1 in the UK, spending an unprecedented 9 weeks at the top spot and eventually selling over 2 million copies. Its longevity in the charts made it an object of derision, however, a Christmas single seen by many as a populist novelty record. And despite its overwhelming success in the UK and other major territories, it was a rare flop in the US.
Mull of Kintyre, oh, mist rolling in from the sea. My desire is always to be on Mull of Kintyre.
It had that faux kind of folk Celtic element in it. You know, it had the sing-along thing. It had a universal appeal, and it came out at Christmas, and it was a bit like Auld Lang Syne or something, and was probably as universally hated as Auld Lang Syne because everybody knew every nuance of it. It's the most, you know, I don't know if it was the most overplayed song of all time, but it certainly seems like that because it was one of those records that was #1 forever. But without the ingenuity of a Bohemian Rhapsody, it was also irritated people. It was #1 for 9 weeks as well. You know, when a record is that successful, it starts to outstay its welcome. And you know, had Mull of Kintyre been some obscure track, or on some obscure B-side, or that people had never properly heard, they probably think, oh, it's quite nice. But I mean, a lot of people can't even bear to hear it anymore, for obvious reasons. It was so overplayed.
Sweet through the heather, like deer in the glen, carry me back to the days I knew then. Nights when we sang like a heavenly choir of the light and the times of the Mull of Kintyre. Mull of Kintyre, oh, mist rolling in from the sea. My desire is always to be here, oh, Mull of Kintyre.
For McCartney to appear in the middle of punk with Mull of Kintyre was a massive anomaly. but not really knowing McCartney. That's the sort of thing he would do. I remember seeing him on Mike Yarwood, and even as a big fan, I was thinking, oh dear, I think he's gone too far up the mums and dads route, even for me. And so I never bought the record, but I completely defend his right to do it and to be the biggest selling single in Britain up to that point. That's because people who never bought records bought that, which for music fans was a bit of a sickener, but there you go, that's part of what McCartney can do. He can tap into a consciousness that other musicians don't even know exists, which is just people who don't even like music very much, but they like that record.
And when the sixth Wings album, London Town, was released in March 1978, it appeared that audiences again reacted enthusiastically to it. Yet despite containing the US #1 single, With a Little Luck, the LP had none of the staying power of its predecessors, and subsequent single releases fared disappointingly. McCartney blamed this lack of success in the US on the promotional campaign of Capitol Records. Yet at a time when punk music was lashing out at the old dinosaurs of rock, many judged it a quaint and insubstantial pop release.
The weird thing about it was that he had the tour, the Wings Over the World tour, had established them as a very proficient hard rocking band. So you would have thought that he would come back after that with a pretty hard rocking album, you know, maybe with one or two ballads, because that's how he rolls, but with the emphasis on the fact that they could play hard rock as well as anybody. But instead, it's a very soft, kind of flabby record.
Walking down the sidewalk on a purple afternoon, I was accosted by a barker, playing a simple tune upon his flute. Toot, 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 toot. Silver rain was falling down upon the dirty ground of London town.
For whatever reason, that explosion of work and popularity they had between 74 through 76 had taken something out of him.
My imaginary street, ordinary people, it's impossible to meet. Holding conversations that are always incomplete, well, I don't know.
His need to work and his need to produce stuff sort of got in the way of his need to, you know, replenish himself as an artist. You know, don't forget that With a Little Luck was a huge hit in the United States of America. It had a huge hit single attached to it. It was a big success on its own terms, but it's just, I think it was definitely a signpost that, that he had stumbled.
With a little luck, we can help it out. We can make this whole damn thing work out. With a little love, we can lay it down. Can't you feel the town exploding? There is no end to what we can do together. There is no end. There is no end.
I think the great masterpiece on London Town is With a Little Luck, which was the big hit single at the time. And in the middle of punk, of course, it sounded like a marshmallow of a record. But it's because of his fantastic use of the synthesizer. He uses it with great taste and great invention. And the synthesizer in those days was not being used as a matter of course on pop records, and certainly not with that level of nuance.
Following his split from Capitol Records, after the disappointing performance of London Town, a compilation album was released in November 1978, Wings' Greatest, an LP that surprisingly performed better in the UK than the US. McCartney was immediately moving on, however. Within 3 months of the release of London Town, he had recruited 2 new Wings members, drummer Steve Holley and guitarist Lawrence Juba, and was at work at his Scottish farm studios on the follow-up. In March 1979, Wings' new single was released. Good Night Tonight, a top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic, was a track that McCartney had begun as a solo project, before adding contributions from Linda, Denny Laine and the new recruits. It was a record that very much acknowledged new directions in contemporary music. Disco had been gaining popularity since it emerged from the underground in the mid-70s, and Goodnight Tonight unashamedly tapped the vein of this thriving and very anti-rock and roll genre.
Unlike quite a lot of his contemporaries, McCartney, as far as I know, didn't ever diss disco. He never put it down. I remember when the Bee Gees started making disco records, and a lot of McCartney's contemporaries were very kind of sniffy about it. He said, I think they're great. He says, I think they're better than they were in the 60s. He's always got disco.
Don't get too tired for love. Don't let it end. Don't say goodnight to love. It may never be the same again. Don't say it. Don't say it. Say anything. Don't say goodnight tonight. Don't say it. Don't say it. Say anything. Don't say goodnight tonight.
Goodnight Tonight is a full-on dance track. Beautiful. And he plays it with great love, great verve, and of course he underpins it with a superb bass line as well. You see, he would have responded to all those chic things. He would have heard what was going on there. Now, it doesn't quite have the gossamer elegance of a chic disco record, but it's not far short. It's a pretty good stab.
June 1979 saw the release of Back to the Egg, and despite the new formation, it would be the final album release from Wings. In the press, McCartney referred to the LP as a return to his rock roots and name-dropped punk bands to illustrate his awareness of contemporary movements. Yet the lead singles in both the US and the UK, Old Siam Sir and Getting Closer, were disappointments, and once again the album underperformed. It began to seem that no matter what the lineup, McCartney was struggling to recapture the form that had catapulted his band into the big time only 5 years beforehand.
I sort of found Steve Holley and Lawrence Juba for the other lineup of Wings, because Steve was a neighbour and Lawrence did a TV show with me, the David Essex show actually. He was the guitar player in the studio band. That's how that came about. You know, you go with what you got then, and then see if it works out, you know. But as I say, you know, they all had their influence on the music, and it was a good influence, I think.
Having had Wings fall apart on him for the second or third time just before recording London Town, I wonder whether putting together the Back to the Egg era Wings was just a sort of reflex habit. I've got a band, I can fill stadiums with it, I'll just get another band. I'll just get another band whether I actually want one or not. I'll just do it because it's become a habit. Since '71, he's had a band and it's worked out pretty well for him. So I'll just get another band. And I think that's probably what happened. He ended up with something he'd been doing out of habit and realised he didn't want to do it anymore.
Yet 2 recordings on the album did indicate that McCartney was still looking for collaborators, but bigger names than those surrounding him in Wings. On both the Rockestra theme and So Glad to See You Here, he assembled an all-star collective including Pete Townshend, Hank Marvin, Pink Floyd's Dave Gilmour, and Led Zeppelin's John Bonham and John Paul Jones. The resultant team effort earned McCartney a Grammy for Best Rock Instrumental Performance, and its live rendition provided one of the highlights of the Concerts for the People of Kampuchea, a series of shows organised by McCartney to raise money for the victims of war-torn Cambodia in late 1979.
Every musician that was in that room, we'd either hung out with, and that's why they were invited. They were friends. You know, there'd all be bands that we'd been and seen or we liked, you know. Let's get Dave Gilmour, we like him, he's in the Pink Floyd, and then we'll get Johnny Bonham, who's a mate of mine from Birmingham. You know, it all kind of went that way. The Who, of course, you know, Moody started with The Who at the Marquee Studios, and everybody basically was in town who could make it. And it was a very, very simple theme. It had to be, because it was an experiment on a piece. Nobody was reading any music, so it wasn't complicated. So we all had to sit down and just play the same and get a big sound, really. see, what they do in studios is that and orchestras, is that they all play the same note, but they're all slightly out of tune. Slightly. It gives it a bigger sound, the oscillation between the notes. And people can do that electronically now, of course, and get a big sound playing once and then double it and treble it and 32 times or whatever. But that was just a bunch of people all playing at the same time. So it was a live, thing of what you can do in the studio. But it was an actual live version of that. Big. The sound was huge.
On one level, it looks like the very antithesis of what might get him a bit of credibility, to get a load of old rock dinosaurs together to play some stupid riff. But on the other hand, it sort of makes sense. As ever, he's following his nose. He's had an idea. He's gonna just see let's see what happens. That seems to be one of his mottos. Something will happen, something will turn up, we'll do something. And interestingly, I know he was very insecure about the whole thing, because while he made all the phone calls and got all the, he had no idea who was going to come down. His big nightmare was that it had been arranged and no one would show up. So as it is, a few biggies turned up. And the track is okay, it's all right. It's neither here nor there, really. It's more interesting in the concerts for Kampuchea. An awful lot of the guys who appeared on the album turned up and put on silly silver suits and did it for charity. In that way, it had its reason, but as an album track, it's neither here nor there, really.
After the release of the album, McCartney's new lineup of Wings took a brief break before undertaking a British tour. Just as he had road-tested the first incarnation of the band at universities in 1972, in November and December 1979, Wings performed at small theatres and arenas rather than stadiums. Plans to continue the tour into Japan the following year would fall through in an almost comical fashion, and the demands of establishing yet another lineup were privately tiring McCartney, although publicly he dismissed suggestions that the band were coming to their natural end.
I think the trick is we enjoy doing it. We've been making records together for about a year with this band, and so it's good fun now to go on the road and to do the songs to people. It's a new experience that we're still enjoying. I suppose when we don't enjoy it, we'll knock it on the head, but at the moment we're enjoying it.
I think he hit the road with these guys, and I think he felt like suddenly he was going through the motions. And then they were supposed to go to Japan and Asia, and then by the summer of 1980 tour the US. But I think part of him felt, and he's admitted as much, that just subconsciously he was done with Wings and done with that part of his career. He'd been in the Beatles for about 10 years, and then he'd just been in Wings for about 10 years. And that, at that point, was the shelf life for bands in his mind, I guess. Though he certainly didn't want the Beatles to break up. But, he sort of wondered aloud himself whether his decision to bring a whacking big bag of pot into the very drug-unfriendly Japan may have been a subconscious gesture on his part to just, to get out of this tour and get out of this band. Hard to know, but he was definitely, I think, realized into himself that he had reached a point where the band structure wasn't going to work for him anymore.
And so in 1980, the post-Beatles career of Paul McCartney turned full circle. Although he began rehearsals for a European tour and a new Wings album, they never came to pass, and the band slowly dissolved. This left McCartney to his own devices, and as in late 1969, when he had crafted his solo debut at home with minimal studio equipment, he set to work on a collection of songs using newly developed musical technology.
Late 79, early 80, with the dawn of the sequencer, that McCartney might have thought to himself, I could have more fun on my own with this stuff. He'd done the multi-tracking thing where he played all the instruments himself, analog, but what if he played with himself and the machines, the drum machine and him? What would happen then? I think maybe that was more interesting to him than going out and doing Hammersmith Odeon and doing Gotta Get You Into My Life, you know, with a horn section again. He just, you know, it just didn't turn him on anymore.
He went through so many musicians in Wings. And I remember at the time, I would meet them as they came into the group, and I would think, well, I hope you enjoy this year. Because in the end, it was Paul. Paul wrote all the hits. Denny Laine gets a co-write on Mull of Kintyre. Well, no surprise, because he was the most substantial person to ever be a Wing, other than Paul. But still, he wasn't of Beatle level. And the fact is, if Paul had wanted to have a group like the Beatles, he would have had to get people like Elton John and Rod Stewart and Queen, who already had their group. You can't just invent greatness. Wings weren't the new Beatles, and there couldn't be a new Beatles. 4 strong personalities, 3 great writers, the 2 greatest writers. Forget looking for the next one. Just be yourself.
Released in May 1980, McCartney 2 combined classic songwriting with more experimental vocal and instrumental tracks that played with the sounds of the emerging electronic movement and provided the newly liberated musician with his first UK #1 album since Venus and Mars. It was preceded by a huge single, Coming Up, that saw him once again top the US charts. Although the LP would divide both critics and audiences, it was a defiant step away from the world of Wings.
Wings, it seems, has come to a natural end through his own lack of interest in the end, as it turns out. And he's left alone, literally alone, in a room with some machines and just fancies making some music again with himself.
McCartney 2 is certainly underrated. It's very, again, it's a very divisive album, and a lot of people just dismiss it. And yeah, it is fragmentary. But having said that, and it is a crucial but, I thought there were a couple of interesting things on it. And I thought Coming Up, the opening song, was a great song, and that was a song that influenced Lennon. Had a big effect on Lennon. Got the old competitive juices going again. I mean, Lennon himself said when he heard that on the radio, it's the first time he praised McCartney for doing a song in ages. I thought it was McCartney addressing the modern world and actually producing a song that did sound engagingly modern and forward-looking without sounding pretentious in any way. It had a very strong melody as well. I thought it was exceptionally good. Waterfalls was another song on there, which is very good indeed.
Don't go jumping waterfalls. Please keep to the jump waterfalls sometimes can make mistakes, and I need love, yeah, I need love, like a second needs an hour, like a raindrop needs a shower, yeah, I need love every minute.
that's the interesting thing about McCartney albums. I think generally, you're always on the lookout on those McCartney albums for the one track that was a classic example of his lovely melody making, and it was usually a ballad. And on Wings at the Speed of Sound it was Warm and Beautiful, and on London Town it was I'm Carrying, and on McCartney 2 it was Waterfalls. There was always one, and significantly there wasn't one on Back to the Egg. Maybe on Venus and Mars, I think that the tune that's underrated is Love in Song. That's the one that actually has got a lot of beauty to it, a lot of atmosphere, a lot of care. Not thought about or talked about very often, but I think that's there on that record. And what you have with McCartney 2 is the classic in there, Waterfalls, which is magnificent.
And I need love, yeah, I need love. Like a castle needs a tower, like a garden needs a flower. Yeah, I need love every minute of the day. And it wouldn't be the same if you ever should decide to go away.
On that record, it's quite refreshing to see him getting away from Wings in a way and trying to re-establish himself. And it was a good time to do it at the end of the decade. McCartney 1 and 2, and they're not so much of a piece, they're very contrasting albums, of course, but when you look at what happened in between, and apart from Band on the Run perhaps, you do end up thinking, well, actually it's good to have McCartney back on his own, and I think the demise of Wings didn't come soon enough. I mean, it was time to move on from that.
And just as McCartney was returning to the fray as a solo artist, his old songwriting partner was finally preparing to end his self-imposed musical exile. In the years since the release of Rock and Roll, Lennon had effectively retired from the business, making a final stage appearance on the TV tribute to Lou Grade in April 1975 and fulfilling his contract with EMI Capitol with a greatest hits compilation, Shaved Fish, in the October of that year. The same month, his son Sean was born, and for the next 5 years he announced that he was putting his creative life on hold to raise his child. Despite reports at the time of his contentment, supported by photographs of his extensive travels and of his domestic bliss, over the years contradictory accounts have emerged, suggesting paranoia, drug addiction, eating disorders, depression and agoraphobia, and a particularly tense relationship with Yoko that was heading towards divorce. The facts are elusive, however, and this period in his life will undoubtedly remain mysterious. Whatever the reasons behind his exile and the details of his domestic life during this period, in 1980, 6 years after the release of Walls and Bridges, John Lennon returned with an album of new material. Sessions had taken place in New York during August and September, with John and Yoko sharing production duties with Jack Douglas, and 2 months later the single Just Like Starting Over was released. In October, Double Fantasy was issued, the first album since some time in New York City to feature the work of both Lennon and Ono. And initially, at least, it was as divisive as that 1972 work, receiving mixed reviews and performing respectably, if not spectacularly, in the charts.
His contributions to Double Fantasy are pretty awesome. I mean, you figure he's got 4 great songs on there, and that's back to the standard of Imagine or the other great post-Beatles solo albums. I mean, Just Like Starting Over, which he called the Elvis one, and Woman, beautiful love song to her, and Watching the Wheels, which is such a great commentary on what he'd been doing the past 5 years, and to just explain that there are things other in life, and you don't have to be at the center. You can watch and dip in and dip out. And then Beautiful Boy, which has moved so many people through time. So it was worth the rest to have those songs.
Our life together is so precious. Together we have grown. We have grown. Although our love is still special, let's take a chance and fly away somewhere.
I remember hearing Just Like Starting Over on the radio when it was released and deciding fairly quickly, while also being ever so interested to hear it, deciding fairly quickly it wasn't very interesting or in fact very good. So I switched off the radio and never gave it another thought and took no notice of the album when it came out. Wasn't interested. If that was going to be the quality of the record, then there was nothing here that was going to interest me. I think what's so disappointing about it is, other than the tunes aren't that great, they're okay, is that this is the time where he actually hasn't got anything to say. Not Mind Games, but Double Fantasy. It was so obviously empty of any urgency or inspiration or anything much else to recommend it either.
It's time to spread our wings and fly. Don't let another day go by, my love. It'll be just like starting over. Starting over. Why don't we take off?
I think what Lennon achieved with Double Fantasy, if he achieved anything, was he probably created the first middle-aged album. And I say that without it being pejorative, because there are many artists now, you know, even the Bob Dylans of this world and Neil Youngs and people who have reached a certain age have done the difficult trick of trying to, how do you create a record about maturity without making it sound cozy, sentimental? And all those other adjectives that we use in a pejorative fashion when talking about that stuff, because it's not rock and roll. And this is the problem that Lennon had. And I think he achieved it on this record, but of course it wasn't what was welcome. I mean, people wanted a rock and roll album. This was in the age of punk and followed by new wave. So in one sense, it's a very unfashionable album as far as certain critics were concerned. At the same time, of course, the album is called Double Fantasy, and therein lies the key to it. It's an artificial construct. This is a projection, an idealised projection of the John and Yoko myth onto the world. It's the way they want their romanticised relationship to be, and it is convincing. And it's convincing, I think, because much of it is real. I mean, there is a genuine affection. You can see them in you know, you can't really fake that stuff. I mean, they've done, you know, the greatest con in history if they pull that one off. And I think the people who say, and some do, that the whole thing is a fantasy and it was just a fraud. The whole John and Yoko thing is complete fraud. I know where they're coming from, because you know you can pluck diary entries out and say, aha, he was going to do this, or would he have divorced her, would he have done that? But in the end, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to judge where that genuine affection begins and ends, and where the fantasy begins and ends. And I think it's both. And in some ways, that's why that album works to me.
Woman, I can hardly express my mixed emotions at my thoughtlessness. After all, I'm forever in your debt. And woman, I will try to express my inner feelings and thankfulness for showing success.
Was an art project. The marriage was an art project. And as an art project, it was fabulously successful. Presented an image of a sexist man who acknowledged his own anger, acknowledged that he used to be cruel to his woman, acknowledged all of that stuff, subsuming it, sublimating it, and becoming something else. Trying to maintain a relationship of equality with a strong woman. And that continues through Double Fantasy. The facts almost don't matter because the image is a very, very strong one, and it would take a clearer rebuttal than we're ever going to get to destroy that image.
Within weeks of the album's release, the image was all that was left. On the 8th of December, 1980, Lennon was shot and killed by the delusional born-again Christian, Mark David Chapman. Met with an international public outpouring of grief, the world of music lost one of its greatest artists, and an audience who had been rejoicing Lennon's return from exile were left stunned by the silencing of their icon. The mixed reviews and underwhelming reaction to Double Fantasy were immediately forgotten. Now his swan song, it rose to #1 across the globe and eventually became his biggest-selling solo LP, earning him a posthumous Grammy for Album of the Year.
It's hard now to imagine those few months when it was out, before he was killed, where actually no one really thought very much of it. But in the wake of his death, it took on this terrible, sentimental, emotional kind of baggage that really, the music itself didn't warrant. It became his sort of legacy. For a lot of people who may or may not have known terribly much about what John Lennon did, but knew that he died and this was his latest record. I've never understood that when someone is killed. You know, I remember it happened with Elvis as well, for people to rush out and buy the latest record, as if that's going to make any difference. But it just is a pattern. People die and other people buy their records straight away. And it's just a shame that so much attention was heaped upon that album, because it doesn't actually warrant that kind of attention. It's the weakest music. I would say it's the weakest music he made in the whole of his solo years. Most of what is important about Lennon had ended by 1975.
Ono released further material featuring Lennon, including the album Season of Glass 6 months after his death, and Milk and Honey in 1984, a collection of material that had been in part recorded during the Double Fantasy sessions and was its intended follow-up. Yet the sense of a songwriter's silence just as he was returning to the stage persists. Throughout the 1970s, the public and the press had been obsessed by the possibility of a Lennon and McCartney reunion, and with Lennon gone, this would obviously never transpire. Yet it remains a topic of frustrated wish fulfillment. If Lennon had lived, would the most famous songwriting partnership in popular music ever have worked together again?
Well, we all get older, and Yoko was getting wiser, and maybe there would have been even a situation where Yoko wouldn't have been around. So I don't think it could have happened. I think it could have happened that the two would have worked together again, yes.
It's difficult to imagine him working with McCartney when Yoko was still there. It just doesn't seem likely somehow. But had she not been there, it depends on the freedom he was feeling. He would have always had, of course, the weight of the Beatles myth to consider. I think that might have deferred him from going down that route. I mean, it wouldn't have been an easy decision to make, to say, all right, I'll do something with Paul McCartney, because the world's media would have been... I mean, it's bad enough coming back with Double Fantasy after that amount of time and being able to, can we pull this off? It's quite nervy, but to be back with McCartney, people are going to expect a record as good as the Beatles. So I think it wouldn't have been an easy decision to make. You know, I can imagine them jamming together, but the actual recording an album together, wow, that's a tricky one. But we'll never know.
Having split from Wings, McCartney's solo career continued to go through its highs and lows. Despite substantial hits during the 1980s and certain standout albums thereafter, by the turn of the century he had, however, very much become a must-see live performer. And a key to the popularity of his shows, like the Wings Over America concerts, was that he would include a number of his major Beatles compositions in the setlist. No matter how long his career has lasted after the breakup of the Beatles, the songs he wrote while a member of the most important band in rock history remain the most loved. And this is also the case with Lennon, that despite the brilliance of his work in the late 60s and early 70s, it is now to the Beatles that people turn when looking for the best of his output. Because it was as a pair, or indeed within a quartet, that Lennon and McCartney shined the brightest. and it is as a pair that they are considered, and will probably remain, the greatest ever popular songwriting duo.
Towards the end, Lennon always characterized their relationship as them cutting each other down. So you have a sense of McCartney's craftsmanship and sense, keeping a lid on Lennon's more extreme emotionalism, and then vice versa, perhaps Lennon keeping an eye out for some of McCartney's slacker lyrics or something like that. Lennon may have seen that as a sort of a diminishing of their individual contributions, but most onlookers see that as a strengthening and as a honing of their contributions. When you've got a trusted fellow genius to run your stuff by, it tends to sharpen up your instincts generally. In the absence of that, for all their qualities as individual songwriters, it never quite hits the same heights for those reasons. There's nobody you have to check it with except yourself. And if we accept that idea of fellow genius to keep your standards high, then it means the Lennon and McCartney team, whether it's an actual writing team or just a gatekeeping arrangement, is the real deal. That's where the real stuff happened. And the solo Lennon and McCartney output is a kind of afterthought.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something I think you'll understand. And I say that something, I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
This is the miracle of this group. How did John meet Paul, meet George, meet Ringo? Okay, we know how they literally met, but the idea that these people could have been walking around in one city at the same time is amazing.
Now let me hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
You just have to have the right conditions, and the Beatles were in the right conditions. Brian Epstein, George Martin, the time, the place, the generation. It's no surprise that no matter how much we love the records of John or Paul, it's the records of John and Paul which have the greatest effect, because that is the voice of a generation, the symbol of a generation, the leader of a generation. It's history now, so it ain't gonna change. They did it.